Congratulations, you've just become a clone trooper, but don't get too excited because, well, I think you're not going to last very long. In this video, we're diving deep into what it actually felt like to live as a clone trooper, and you'll feel it all like you're walking in their boots. So grab a snack, get comfortable, and settle in. This is going to be such an experience, and drop a comment letting me know where you're tuning in from. It's always awesome seeing where Star Wars fans are watching from across the galaxy. And if you end up enjoying these stories, consider subscribing. It helps a lot. Now let's begin. Welcome to Kamino, buddy. Yeah, this wet, stormy planet that looks like it's just one giant ocean, with some giant labs floating on top. Now you might think, hey, this sounds kind of sci-fi cool. But nah, it's more like waking up in a super sterile swimming pool that never ends. Just rain, rain and more rain. Oh, and some serious humidity, like that feeling when your clothes stick to your skin and you just want to take a shower every 5 minutes. But the shower's just more cold white walls. You're a clone trooper, but not like some badass warrior yet. Right now, you're basically a freshly minted batch of military-grade humans. All exactly the same, looking like that one they called Jango Fett because, spoiler, he's your genetic dad. Yeah, your dad is this mercenary who somehow ended up being the blueprint for thousands of soldiers. That's a weird family reunion waiting to happen. Anyway, on Kamino you don't have a normal childhood. Forget about birthdays, playing outside, or even choosing what you want to be when you grow up. You're basically grown in these giant tanks filled with some nutrient soup, kind of like a weird alien smoothie bar, but for humans. And yeah, everyone else looks just like you. Like you and your identical twins got multiplied a few thousand times. The scientists on Kamino, those guys are always in their white coats, constantly poking, prodding, and measuring stuff. They're like the weirdest parents ever. The training starts early, but I'm not talking about normal training, like sports or school. It's military drills, target practice, simulations of battles you haven't even heard of yet, and lectures about discipline, loyalty, and following orders. And don't get me wrong, you're not exactly allowed to complain. You don't have much choice here. Now, the clones aren't just raised to be soldiers. There's this whole obsession with genetic perfection. The Kaminoans are always tweaking stuff, trying to make the perfect fighting machine. Faster reflexes, stronger muscles, better aim. It's like if you were a video game character and someone kept buffing your stats every day. But all that comes with a price. Here's a fun fact for you. The clones age twice as fast as normal humans. Yeah, you don't get the luxury of a slow, awkward adolescence. You're basically rushed through childhood like you're some kind of express train to soldierhood. That also means you don't have a lot of time to figure out who you really are outside of being a clone. Identity crisis? Nah, more like an identity blackout. You're mostly programmed to obey and fight, not to wonder if you'd rather be a baker or a poet. Though I bet a clone poet would be interesting. Kamino itself doesn't really help with that either. It's a super efficient factory for soldiers, not a place to find yourself. The city stations are all sleek and shiny but cold, with hallways that echo footsteps and not much else. Social life? Forget it. You don't hang out at cafes or bars. You hang out in training rooms, mess halls, and occasionally medical bays when someone gets hurt. Your buddies? Yeah, they're pretty much the only people you know. But since you all look and sound the same, sometimes it's hard to tell who's who. Imagine trying to prank someone when you're all clones. Good luck pulling that off. Though I guess you could confuse the enemy pretty easily by switching places. And there's always this weird feeling in the back of your head, like you're part of something huge, but also kinda disposable. The Kaminoans and the Republic brass see you as a tool, a weapon, a product on a conveyor belt. It's like being a cog in a massive machine. And sometimes you wonder if anyone actually cares about you as a person, or if you're just another clone number. But hey, you do get perks, at least if you consider endless physical conditioning and hyper-efficient combat training perks. You'll be in peak shape, capable of stuff most normal humans only dream about. Your reflexes are sharp, your endurance insane, and your discipline? Well, that's drilled into you like a mantra. Still, the whole thing is a bit crazy if you think about it. You didn't choose this life. You were created for one purpose: to be soldiers in a galaxy that's slowly losing its mind. And all of this starts right here, on this rainy planet with endless oceans, where your life is a cycle of waking up, training, testing, and repeating. And this is just the beginning, the part where you're still on Kamino, learning what it means to be a clone trooper. The moment when the world outside those white walls feels like a distant dream, and your reality is a stormy planet that never lets up. So, your day on Kamino? It starts early, always early. You don't get to hit snooze, roll over and think, just 5 more minutes. You're up when the lights come on. Same sterile brightness every morning, like they just flipped the switch on a factory floor, which, to be honest, kind of fits. And every day's the same. You wake up, you get cleaned up, which weirdly isn't a normal thing here either. It's not like you've got a personal shower or even privacy. Nope. Everyone lines up, everyone showers, everyone moves together like a machine. That's kind of the point. You're trained not just to fight, but to live like part of a system. No individual rhythm, just one beat, and you fall in line. Then there's breakfast. It's functional. Not bad, just food. Enough protein to keep you moving, and enough routine to make you stop thinking about flavour. Nobody's out here comparing spice levels or talking about what fruit's in season. It's more like, here's the fuel, eat it, move on. You don't talk much at meals either, not because you're not allowed, just because, what is there to say? Everyone's doing the same thing, same schedule, same expectations. You can only compare blaster handling scores so many times before it gets boring. After that, target practice, squad maneuvers, obstacle runs, hand-to-hand combat. Some of it's actually kind of cool in a weird way. You start to understand your limits and then break them. But the weird part, even when you get better, so does everyone else. You never really stand out because the bar keeps moving up with you. And that's something that messes with your head a little. Like, you're constantly surrounded by people who look just like you, move like you, even think like you. And that makes figuring out who you are almost impossible. You try to carve out tiny things, little habits. Maybe you tie your boots a certain way. Maybe you're the guy who can always do the course blindfolded. Maybe you've got a sense of humour that helps your squad laugh when things get tough. But those are small victories, and they're easy to lose track of. You get evaluated constantly. There are scores for everything: aim, reaction time, physical strength, obedience. You're not being raised, you're being rated, like a product. And sure, they don't say that, but it's hard to ignore. Especially when the Kaminoans walk around with datapads, tapping notes like they're shopping for speeder parts. And honestly, those Kaminoans, they're strange. Cold, super smart, yeah, but they talk like everything's theoretical. Like you're not even there sometimes. Like you're a batch of numbers, not a person. You could be right in front of them, bruised from training, catching your breath, and they'll just be discussing genetic stability like it's a math problem. There's no warmth, no, hey, how are you holding up? Just data and results. Not everyone is like that. There are trainers, clone instructors, a few older clones who got pulled out of combat rotation to help guide the newer ones. Those guys, they're different. You can tell they've seen stuff. Sometimes they'll sneak in a real conversation, a piece of advice, a joke, something that reminds you that even in this machine, there are still people trying to keep their humanity. Even if it's just through sarcasm and telling you where not to stand in a live fire drill. And then there's your squad, the closest thing you have to family. You train together, eat together, sleep in the same barracks, go through the same pain. You get to know their little quirks. The one who hums while running, the guy who can fall asleep instantly anywhere, the guy who talks in his sleep and sometimes says weird stuff about food. That's where you start to feel something like connection. Not because you're genetically the same, but because you've been through the exact same routine over and over again, side by side. Even on Kamino, you do get a little downtime. Not much, but enough to breathe. And during those moments, you can feel a kind of stillness that's hard to explain. You might stare out a window and watch the rain for a few minutes, not because you're deep or anything, but because that rain is always there, and somehow it becomes familiar. Comforting even. The galaxy feels really far away when you're in that kind of quiet. Like war is just a rumour, and you're just some kid stuck in an endless storm. But that storm outside kind of becomes part of you. You train while it rages, you sleep through it, you wake up and hear it every single day. It's always there, like a background hum reminding you that this place is temporary. You're not meant to stay on Kamino forever. This is the start line. So here's the part nobody talks about when they tell you what it meant to be a clone trooper. You grow up on Kamino thinking you were made to protect the Republic. That's what they drill into you from day one. Your purpose is to serve. You're a soldier because the galaxy needed you, because the Republic couldn't survive without you. You don't question it. Why would you? You've never known anything else. You've never had a reason to doubt the story, but the story doesn't start with you. It starts before you were even grown. You were created for a war that hadn't happened yet. not as a response to danger, not because the Republic was desperate, but because someone wanted that war to exist in the first place. And that's where things start getting strange. They say the clone army was ordered by Jedi Master Sifo Dyas. That's the official line. He supposedly foresaw some great conflict on the horizon, decided the Republic needed to be ready, and went behind the Council's back to commission an army. People talk about it like he was some kind of rogue visionary who just wanted to protect the galaxy. But there's a hole in that story so big you could fly a cruiser through it. Sifo Dyas died around the same time the order was supposedly placed, and not in some peaceful old age kind of way. He died under suspicious circumstances. A ship crash, conveniently far from anyone who could verify what really happened. So if he was gone, who kept the project alive? Who followed through? Who wrote the checks? The Kaminoans didn't do it out of kindness. Cloning millions of soldiers doesn't come cheap, and they weren't exactly offering discounts. The Republic didn't fund it. The Senate didn't even know it existed. The Jedi Council never signed off on it, and yet the army was being built, quietly, efficiently, years before anyone in the Republic even realized they'd need one. Someone was pulling the strings, and the only person who had the position, the reach, and the motive to pull it off was Palpatine. You probably didn't think much about him at the time, just another politician, another face in the background, always saying the right things. He played it safe. He talked about peace, though. He reassured everyone that the Republic would stand strong. But while he was doing that in public, he was setting things in motion behind the scenes. Not as Chancellor, as Darth Sidious. He used Count Dooku to handle the things he couldn't be seen touching. Dooku hired Jango Fett, who became the genetic template for every clone that followed. Dooku worked out the deal with the Kaminoans. He set up the systems, the contracts, the whole operation. All of it happened in the shadows, and all of it was designed to look like it came from Sifo Dyas, a Jedi cover story, a perfect distraction, and it worked. By the time anyone started asking questions, the war was already on. Geonosis was burning. Jedi were dying. The Senate was panicking. And there you were, armor polished, rifles loaded, ready to go. The timing wasn't just lucky, it was planned. The Republic didn't know it had an army until the very moment it needed one. The Separatists rise up, battle droids start marching, and suddenly this mysterious clone force appears, fully trained, fully equipped, and ready to fight. People treated it like a miracle. It was a setup. Palpatine knew the Republic would never agree to an army in peacetime, so he made sure the war happened first. He created the crisis, then he handed them the solution. And because the galaxy was too busy trying to stay alive, nobody stopped to think about how strange it all was. They didn't ask where the army came from, they just used it. You were part of that, from the very beginning. And that's the part that stings, because everything you believed in, the Republic, the Jedi, the cause, all of it was built on something fake. You were made for a war that was always going to happen, because it was designed to happen. It was engineered. Your entire existence was part of a long-term strategy to put Palpatine in control. And you didn't know. How could you? You weren't raised to look for secrets. You were raised to follow orders. The people training you didn't even know the truth themselves. The Kaminoans thought they were delivering a product. The Jedi thought they were getting reinforcements. You just wanted to do your job and keep your brothers alive. That's what makes it hard to swallow. You did everything right. You trained, you served, you fought with everything you had. You weren't just some mindless weapon. You built bonds, you made friends, you earned your stripes. But behind all of that, the war was never about what you thought it was. You weren't protecting peace. You were pushing the galaxy closer to Palpatine's endgame. And even though none of it was your fault, you were the one carrying the weight. Every mission, every battle, every loss, you were the one bleeding for a plan you didn't even know existed. A plan that used you from day one. And here's the worst part. This wasn't some last-minute betrayal. It wasn't a sudden twist. This was the foundation. The whole thing was fake from the start. That doesn't erase what you did. It doesn't make your sacrifices meaningless. But it does change how you see everything. Because once you realize the war was never really about the Republic, it forces you to ask, what were you really fighting for? So now you're out there. War's broken out. Geonosis was just the beginning. And suddenly you and your brothers are being shipped off across the galaxy like your tools in a giant toolbox. The Jedi step into their roles as generals, the Senate issues orders, like they've been running armies forever, and the whole galaxy starts adjusting, like this was all perfectly natural. Like it wasn't weird that millions of identical soldiers just appeared overnight, ready for war. But for you, it's just go time. You've trained your whole life for this, so you do what you're meant to do. You fight, you follow orders. You lock in with your squad, land on strange planets you've only seen in simulators, and get to work. And for a while, that focus kind of works. There's no time to stop and think about who started the war or how you got here. You're too busy staying alive, but even early on things feel off. You start noticing little contradictions, like how some Jedi are completely lost when it comes to military tactics, but no one questions putting them in charge of thousands of troops. One minute you're being led by a Jedi who genuinely cares about your lives. The next, you're charging headfirst into a fortified position because another one had a feeling. It's not that they're evil or cruel, it's that most of them were never trained for this. They were peacekeepers, philosophers. Suddenly they're generals overnight, and you're the ones paying the price for their learning curve. And it's not just the Jedi. The entire war feels strange in ways you can't explain at first. There's this weird rhythm to it. You take a planet after weeks of brutal fighting, only to be called off it days later. You capture some critical target, only to hear that command already gave it up in negotiations. Whole battles feel like they're more about making headlines than making progress. Like they're staged to show that the Republic is winning, even when nothing actually changes. Meanwhile, the Separatists seem to have endless droids and weapons, like they're never running low. They're always prepared, always dug in before you even land. It's like someone's feeding both sides the same script, like the war is being managed, not fought. You wouldn't dare say that out loud though. You're a clone. That's not your job. Your job is to fight, not to question the rules. Still, the feeling lingers, and then there's how you're treated. Not by your brothers. They're the only people who get it, but by everyone else. You notice how quickly people forget that you're human. In briefings, you're numbers. In the Senate, you're assets. On the holonet, you're referred to as troop movements and military resources. No one calls you soldiers, no one calls you men. You see senators giving speeches about how proud they are of the clone army, and you know they couldn't care less about the individuals inside the armor. It's like you're a product they ordered, and now they're patting themselves on the back for using it. And Kamino? They're still collecting credits like it's a delivery service. Your existence is a contract, not a cause. There's no leave and no retirement plan. You're bred for this, trained for this, and deployed until you're dead or too broken to keep going. That's it. You can feel it in the way officers talk about reinforcements. If your squad takes heavy losses, they don't mourn. They requisition more clones. And sure, your brothers help you keep going. There's a kind of comfort in knowing everyone around you understands what you're going through. You develop unspoken communication, inside jokes, nicknames that make no sense to anyone else. Those little things are what keep you sane. But you also start noticing how quickly clones burn out. Guys who are sharp, confident, unshakable. You watch them fall apart after too many deployments. Not because they're weak, because they were never given a chance to be anything else. And through all of this, no one ever circles back to that question. Where did this army come from? Why was it ready before the war even started? Who actually gave the green light? It's like everyone silently agreed not to bring it up. The Jedi don't ask, the Senate doesn't investigate, the Kaminoans don't explain. But you're not stupid and you don't need a full investigation to know something doesn't line up. You just look around. The galaxy's on fire, and yet the man in charge, Chancellor Palpatine, keeps gaining more control with every passing cycle. Emergency powers, executive orders, unrestricted military authority. And somehow, the longer the war drags on, the more people trust him to fix it. Now let's go back to your roots, the Kaminoans. Who were they really? We only saw them a few times in the movies, and it just kinda sucks. They were the ones in charge of everything. The facility, your development, your training structure, your food, your sleep schedule, your haircuts, all of it. From the first second you were flash-grown in a tube to the day you stepped off the platform for deployment, they were there, measuring, recording, always recording. You know how you can usually tell what someone's thinking by looking at their face? Yeah, not with these ones. Their faces were like statues. Thin, pale, stretched, smooth, like someone ironed them too much. Big dark eyes that just stare at you like they're trying to decide if your bones are symmetrical. It didn't matter what they were saying. You could be doing a training drill or failing a health check, They always sounded like they were reading instructions off a cereal box. And it's not that they were evil, they weren't cruel. They didn't walk around with whips or throw tantrums when you messed up. They just didn't seem to care. You ever wonder how the Kaminoans got so good at making people? It's not like they were just copying a recipe or pressing buttons on a console. These weren't factory droids assembling battle units. They weren't engineers. They were something else entirely. Cold and smart, and honestly, kind of terrifying when you really sat with it. Their whole species was built around that mindset. You'd see it in the way they moved. Slow, deliberate, like they never wasted a single motion. They were tall, yeah, really tall, with arms that hung just a little too low and fingers that seemed like they were always measuring something. Their skin was this smooth, pale grey, like it was never touched by the sun. Their necks were long, their faces narrow, and their eyes, man, those eyes didn't blink enough. Big, glassy, pitch black, like they were always watching the world from behind a pane of glass. You'd walk past one, and they'd follow you with those eyes. They'd stare at you like you were a lab test that just got out of its tank. It wasn't threatening, just uncomfortable. Like you were never entirely real in their eyes, just a piece of work they were still refining. And you could feel how much smarter they were. They weren't running around showing off or bragging about their IQ. They were subtle, they were precise. They didn't need to prove how smart they were because the results spoke for themselves. They cracked cloning on a scale nobody else in the galaxy had even come close to. Billions of identical soldiers, trained and genetically tuned to fight from birth. And somehow, it worked. That shouldn't have been possible. But to them, that was just the job. They didn't see clones as individuals. They saw outcomes, patterns, success rates. You were a result, and honestly, it made sense. These were beings whose brains were probably running calculations before they finished a sentence. It's not that they chose to be cold, they just operated on a completely different level. They saw DNA the way we see schematics. They didn't need trial and error. They looked at Jango Fett's genetic code and said, yeah, we can make 10 million of that, better even. And they did. They enhanced the base model, tweaked aggression, boosted reflexes, suppressed certain independent tendencies. And they did it all without making you unstable. They talked about modifications, like they were swapping out hardware. You'd overhear one say something like, Batch A needed aggression dampening, Batch B required memory acceleration. And that was normal. They didn't think of it as tampering with a person. They were just calibrating. Even their labs didn't feel like medical facilities. Everything was spotless, glowing white, eerily quiet. You'd walk through a cloning wing, and it felt more like a museum than a birth center. No noise, no warmth, no emotion, just rows of chambers, silent monitors, soft footfalls echoing against the glass floors. You could hear your own breathing in there louder than anything else. And the strangest part, they didn't celebrate anything. You could walk past 100 fully developed clones stepping into their first training session, and the Kaminoans wouldn't so much as nod. Just another phase completed, just another metric hit. And they never asked questions. Not about you, not about the war, not even about the Republic. As long as the contract was valid and the credits kept arriving, they kept the operation moving. It didn't matter who the clones were going to fight. It didn't matter what kind of future they were helping to build. The Kaminoans weren't politicians or idealists. They were problem solvers. And their problem was, how do you mass-produce life that follows orders and wins wars? They solved it, and then some. You know how some people talk to their pets with more emotion than they talk to other people? Well, the Kaminoans didn't even manage that. You could have been a pair of boots to them, or a chair with a heartbeat. They only cared if you were meeting performance metrics. We all just kind of accepted it. It was normal. The Kaminoans were always like that, so we never expected them to act otherwise. You didn't sit around hoping they'd start handing out birthday cakes or asking about your hobbies. You just learned early on that if you wanted anything close to a human connection, you had to find it in your brothers. And honestly, that made us tighter. You didn't bond with your instructors. You bonded with the guy next to you in the shooting range, the one who snuck you extra rations, the one who took the blame when your blaster jammed. The Kaminoans didn't create that part. They didn't even care it was happening. But it's the only reason we came out as people, not machines. And let's talk about their whole business model for a second. The Kaminoans weren't part of the Republic anymore. Not really. They'd pulled away years before, kept to themselves, stayed out of the politics. By the time the war rolled around, they were basically just arms dealers with lab coats and ridiculously long necks. And the client with the deepest pockets? That was Palpatine. Surprise, surprise, they didn't ask why the army was being built. They didn't ask who was paying the bills. They had the contract. That's all they cared about. They didn't care whether you were going to be used to defend the innocent or burn a city to the ground. As long as the credits kept coming, the cloning kept going. And there's something a little unsettling about that, when you really stop to think about it. Like, yeah, they gave you life. They engineered you, trained you, raised you, in their own cold, disconnected way. But they never saw you as yours. You were always a product, a batch, a line item, and honestly, sometimes it showed in the way they looked at you. Like they were always calculating, like they were always wondering if the next version might be better, like they were already thinking about your replacement before you'd even stepped off the training floor. It messes with your head after a while. I mean, think about it. The Kaminoans were literally in the business of creating people. Not raising them, not teaching them, creating them. And they didn't see anything weird about that. They talked about new clones like they were adjusting a recipe. We'll try a bit more aggression in the next batch, or this one's reflexes are slightly below optimal range. They talked about your personality like it was a setting they could toggle. Like, if you were too quiet, that was a bug. If you showed too much independence, that was a problem. They wanted you smart enough to follow orders, strong enough to survive a battlefield, but not so curious that you started asking questions. It was all balance. Performance tuning. Like they were working on a line of blenders, not people. And we learned to live with that. Or maybe adapt is a better word. You stop expecting warmth. You get used to the silence. You get used to doing everything with people who act like they're always 3 steps removed from reality. You get used to never hearing a good job, even when you're limping back from a training run with your armor scorched and your lungs on fire. You just learn that if you want to feel human, it's going to come from the guy in the bunk next to you, not the long-necked scientists watching you from the observation deck. And weirdest of all, you kind of miss them when you leave. Not in a sentimental way, just because it's the only life you knew. Kamino might have been cold, sterile, and full of emotionally unavailable aliens, but it was home in a twisted way. You leave the planet, and suddenly you're surrounded by senators, droids, civilians, Jedi, people who all look at you and don't see a person either, just a uniform. So yeah, the Kaminoans were strange, but they were consistent, and at least you always knew where you stood with them. In a galaxy full of lies, manipulation, and politicians smiling through their teeth, that kind of cold honesty almost felt refreshing. And here's where it gets uncomfortable, because as much as we hated the way they saw us as products, we also kind of relied on their genius. You couldn't ignore it. You were the result of it. You were fast, strong, sharp, and capable because of their work. And even though they didn't show you love or warmth, they never lost control of the science. That's why your blaster didn't shake in your hand, why your tactics made sense in the field, why your mind didn't collapse under pressure at age 12. They understood you on a level you couldn't return, and that kind of power, creating people who couldn't match their creators, that's the kind of thing that leaves a mark, even if nobody talks about it. Looking back, it makes you wonder what else they were capable of, what else they knew how to build, because if they could design an entire army of soldiers to serve a war that wasn't even real, what do you think they'd build next, if someone paid enough? We already talked about Kamino on the surface, but let's go a little deeper now. First of all, there's no land, like none. Dirt, hills, forests, only ocean, everywhere, every direction. It's just endless water and storms that never shut up. You look out a window, you see waves, you go to sleep, it's rain. You wake up, still rain. And not a light sprinkle either. It's like the sky's having a breakdown 24/7. You don't walk on ground growing up on Kamino. You walk on metal walkways built above the sea. The cities, if you can even call them cities, are raised up on these massive support columns, like someone built a whole civilization on stilts. Everything's just kind of suspended over the water, and it always feels temporary, like if a big enough wave came along, the whole place could just slide off into the ocean and disappear. And yeah, the walkways? Narrow, slippery, no guardrails in some places. You don't really notice it when you're a kid, but looking back, yeah, it's kind of wild how close you were to falling off into nowhere your whole life. And you don't want to fall into that ocean. Kamino's not like other water planets. That sea isn't inviting, it's pitch black, it goes down forever. And nobody tells you what's actually down there. Like we knew the Kaminoans had cities below the surface too. Science facilities, data cores. who knows what else. But regular clones didn't go down there. That was for the scientists, not us. We stayed topside, which was fine, honestly, because the idea of being even closer to the bottom of that ocean, yeah, no thanks. Now the weather, it's not just annoying, it gets into your head after a while. You start thinking in grey, everything's wet, the walls hum from the wind pressure, the windows rattle sometimes. When lightning hits, it lights up the whole sky like someone's holding a flashlight to the clouds. And thunder? You don't just hear it, you feel it. It shakes the platforms, rolls through your bones. But the weird thing is, after a while, you stop noticing. It becomes background noise. Your brain just tunes it out. And then there's the sky. You never see stars on Kamino. Never once. It's always overcast, storming, and dark. And because of that, you never really get a sense of time. Kamino doesn't have a sunrise or sunset. The light outside just kind of shifts between less grey and more grey. The facilities simulate a day-night cycle with artificial lighting, but it doesn't feel real. You don't grow up with shadows that stretch as the sun moves, or the warmth of actual daylight on your face. Just cold white light in sterile rooms and a wall of rain outside. There's no airfield, spaceport with shops and chatter or cities where you can go out for food, or even see people who aren't clones or Kaminoans. You never hear music unless someone snuck in a datapad with recordings. You never smell anything except polished metal, cleaning agents, and wet armor. There's nothing that feels alive. Even the sea feels artificial somehow. You never see fish, birds, or animals at all. Just this massive, empty, violent ocean that's always moving but never really doing anything. And the part that messes with you the most? You don't realize how strange it is until you leave. Like, imagine stepping off Kamino for the first time and landing on a planet with dirt. Actual dirt. You see a tree for the first time, and you're like, wait, these things are real? You smell food cooking in the open, and it hits you like a punch in the face. The first time you see a sunset that's not just a lighting cycle, it's weirdly emotional. You don't even know why. You just stand there like an idiot thinking, wow, the sky has colour. Kamino doesn't prepare you for that. It prepares you for war, sure. So when people ask what Kamino was like, it's hard to answer. It wasn't like a city. It wasn't like a military base. It was more like a holding pattern, a waiting room with walls, a place designed not to live in, but to pass through. You were never meant to grow old there. You were meant to be made, tested, assigned a squad, and then sent away. And that's why no one talks about what happens to Kamino when the war ends. Because nobody's thinking about the planet. Nobody's asking if it'll keep going, or if it'll vanish once the galaxy's done using it. Because the truth is, Kamino's not a home. It's a factory. Just floating in the middle of the sea, far from everything, making soldiers who'll never come back. And yeah, if you've never seen real sunlight until you're 10 years old, it does kind of mess with your idea of what's normal. The first time you saw another world, really saw one, your brain almost rejected it. It looked fake. The colours didn't make sense. The sky was too bright. The clouds didn't stretch for miles in one endless storm system. There were no platforms or metal walkways. Land only. Uneven, cracked, textured land. Dust blowing through the air. Actual wind. And the sun. The sun was a whole other thing. It wasn't a cold light panel humming above your head. It burned and it had weight. You could feel it on your skin and in your armour. And the smell? Wild, dry heat. Burnt rock, oil, smoke and gunpowder. Something organic too. Maybe plants. Kamino never smelled like that. Kamino didn't smell like anything. And the sound, man, you don't notice how quiet Kamino was until you hear a battlefield for the first time. There, the silence meant something. On Kamino, silence was just part of the background. On deployment, silence was a warning. But most of the time, there was noise. Engines humming overhead, blaster fire in the distance, even civilians yelling at each other about who stole what. That was a trip too. Regular people. You'd only ever seen Kaminoans and clones before. Then you're suddenly walking past farmers, merchants, kids, actual kids, looking up at you with this mix of fear and curiosity. And none of them look like you. Different species. And for a split second you realise they don't even know what you are. To them, you're just another armoured guy with a blaster. They don't know how you were trained, where you came from, how old you really are. They just see a helmet and assume you've got it all figured out. But the truth is, you don't. Not yet. That first mission, you're still trying to understand the basics. The terrain's unfamiliar. Your boots hit ground that isn't flat, and your legs don't like it. You stumble a little. trying to adjust to uneven footing. On Kamino, everything was sterile, straight, controlled. Out here, things are messy. You step on a rock and your ankle rolls. You crouch and dust flies in your visor. You lean against a wall and realize it's hot. You adapt quickly because you're built to. But there's a weird disorientation that doesn't go away right away. Like your body's ready for war, but your mind is still catching up to the fact that the world isn't made of clean lines and white corridors anymore. And then there's the fighting. That first engagement, it's not like the training simulations. It's louder, sloppier, dirtier. Droids don't stand in neat lines like they do in the Hollows. Civilians don't clear the streets just because you showed up. The enemy doesn't wait for you to give orders. It all starts fast and gets confusing even faster. You realize that all those years on Kamino, they did something right. Because even though your heart's hammering and your visor's fogged and you can barely hear your own thoughts, you're still standing. You're doing the job. After the mission, you don't get a medal, you don't get a break, you get new orders. But that night, lying in the dirt under a tarp with your brothers snoring beside you, you finally have something Kamino couldn't give you, a memory that belongs to you. And yeah, your armor's scratched and your shoulders hurt. There's mud in your boots and you smell like carbon and sweat. But weirdly enough, you're proud of that, because you finally feel like a soldier, not a product. Now that we left Kamino behind, they threw you into a war. You ever think about how weird it was that no one actually explained the war to you? Like, sure, you were trained to fight. You knew what a battle droid looked like. But the big picture, the actual why behind any of it, that part was always fuzzy, or just skipped entirely. You knew the word separatists. Yeah, that came up in training now and then. They were the enemy, you were told. They were threatening the Republic. But nobody sat you down and walked through the politics, who they were and what they wanted. That stuff wasn't in the lesson plan. If it was, you probably blinked and missed it. And honestly, that was the point. Clones weren't designed to ask questions. You could think, sure, you could adapt, improvise, even joke around when the moment called for it. But when it came to the bigger picture, you followed orders. So when the war started, and they told you the separatists were the enemy, that was enough. You didn't stop to ask who they were or why they were leaving the Republic. All you knew was they had droids, they were attacking systems, and you were going to stop them. And that war, it kicked off hard and fast. Geonosis was the big opening act, the first time the clones went public. Before that, the galaxy didn't even know the Republic had an army. Then suddenly, boom, Jedi show up in an arena with hundreds of separatist droids closing in, and the clones roll in like, surprise, we exist now. That was the start. From there, it was non-stop, barely any time to breathe. Geonosis was just the first domino. After that, you were jumping planet to planet like your boots had hyperdrives. One week it was Moonilinst, then it was Ryloth, then Umbara, then Saleucami, then Felucia, and those are just the ones people remember. Half the time, you were fighting on systems you couldn't pronounce, on planets that barely showed up on maps, and the missions all blurred together. Different terrain, locals. Sometimes you were rescuing hostages, sometimes defending a supply route, sometimes blowing up a comms array in the middle of nowhere. It didn't matter where you were or what the reason was. The answer was always the same. Go there, shoot those, don't die. At some point you start to realize nobody really talks about why this war is happening. The Jedi never bring it up. Your commanders don't bring it up. You ask, why did the separatists even split off? And you get a shrug or a, that's above your clearance. Like, all right, guess I'll just go back to dodging rockets and patching my armor with scrap metal. And the enemy? Yeah, they were droids mostly, which made it easy to not think too hard about what you were doing. Clankers didn't bleed, they didn't scream, they didn't surrender. You could mow down whole squads of them and not feel a thing. Just another busted heap of bolts on the field. Sometimes you were fighting alongside local militia or trying to evacuate civilians, and it got messier, especially on the Outer Rim. Some systems didn't want the Republic back, they didn't trust clones, they didn't want Jedi. And it made you think, even just a little, why? What were they so mad about? What were they promised by the separatists that made them jump ship in the first place? But the war didn't give you space to dwell on that stuff. You could be curious on your own time, which usually meant never. Now the Jedi, that was another layer of confusion. They were your generals, sure, and most of them were good at it. Some even fought alongside you like real soldiers. But they weren't soldiers, not really, you could tell. They had that whole peacekeeper energy. like they still believed they were helping, like this was all temporary. Some of them, especially the younger ones, seemed totally out of their depth, like the Order threw them into command and said, "Figure it out." But the Jedi never questioned the war either. Not out loud anyway. Maybe they thought about it, maybe they had doubts, but they never let them show. And if they weren't asking questions, well, why would you? So day after day, system after system, you kept doing what you were bred to do, even when the war got weird. Like that time a senator tried to defect, and the mission suddenly changed halfway through, or when a separatist leader surrendered, and then somehow escaped and you were told not to ask about it, or when intel kept changing, and you got sent into a battle that made no sense tactically, and half your squad got fried because of it. You had moments where things just didn't add up. And you started to wonder, not in a rebellious way, just quietly, whether someone was playing a longer game you weren't seeing. Like there was a script written before the war even started, and you were just reading your lines without realizing it. Alright, so you remember General Krell, right? The guy with the deep voice and that super intense stare that could probably make a womp rat freeze in its tracks. Yeah, that Krell. At first, everyone thought he was just another Jedi general doing his job, but Umbara turned out to be where he showed his true colours. And spoiler alert, they weren't exactly gold. Now, clones look up to Jedi. It's part of the whole deal. They're bred to trust them, follow their orders, even die for them if needed. Jedi are supposed to be the good guys. Wise, calm, and, not the kind of people who order you into the meat grinder for kicks. So when Krell started acting, well, off, it really threw everyone. It began small. You know those moments when a boss starts making weird decisions and everyone's like, huh, okay, that's odd. But you keep your mouth shut because, well, that's your boss? Yeah, that was Krell. The clones noticed that he seemed way harsher than the other Jedi generals they'd worked with. No jokes, no easy camaraderie, just cold orders. One of the more bizarre things was how Krell treated the clone troopers like they were just tools. Like, if he needed to clear a hill, he'd order a full charge without worrying about how many guys got blasted on the way. And it wasn't the usual, this is war, suck it up kind of tough. It was more like he almost enjoyed pushing clones to their limits. Not in a let's win this battle way, but more like he was detached and didn't care if they got shredded. Clones started to whisper among themselves, is this guy even on our side? Because the way Krell was leading, it didn't feel like the Jedi General who had their backs anymore. Instead, it felt like he was working some other angle, maybe even against them. Things got worse when Krell started ordering maneuvers that made zero tactical sense, like throwing men into traps or refusing to pull back when it was obvious the squad was toast. You know that feeling when your gut screams, run, but your boss says stay and fight? That's the kind of nightmare Krell was cooking up. And it wasn't just the physical danger. The clones could feel something was wrong on a deeper level. Their leader wasn't just reckless, he seemed almost hostile toward them. It's hard to explain, but the vibe around Krell got heavy, like the air before a lightning storm. Now, the clones might be genetically engineered soldiers, but they're not emotionless robots. They had brothers out there dying, and when their leader didn't seem to care, it messed with their heads. You can imagine how confusing and frustrating it was. They were trained to be obedient, but even obedience has its limits. There's a story from one of the squad leaders who said that during one mission, Krell ignored repeated calls for backup. The squad was pinned down, surrounded, and begging for help. Krell just watched from his command post like he was playing hollow chess or something. Eventually, that squad got wiped out. It was moments like that which started changing the clones' respect for Krell into fear, and later, straight-up hatred. But here's the kicker. The biggest betrayal wasn't just his battle tactics. It was what Krell did when he crossed the line from general to something else entirely. I'm talking about when Krell started actively turning against his own men. Yeah, it sounds crazy, right? A Jedi who's supposed to be on your side actually sabotaging you? But that's exactly what happened on Umbara. At some point, Krell started working with the enemy, or at least acting like it, giving them info, setting traps, and doing things that only made sense if he was trying to lose. The clones were shell-shocked. Their trusted leader was becoming the biggest threat they faced. You ever have that moment when your friend suddenly stabs you in the back? Now imagine your boss doing that while you're stuck in a deadly swamp, with blasters firing all around. That's the kind of betrayal that leaves scars. The worst part? The Jedi Council didn't catch on right away. Krell kept his rank for a while, meaning clones had to follow his orders even as things went downhill. They were stuck between following the chain of command and protecting themselves from their own general. And just so you know, the clones did what they could. They talked amongst themselves, tried to find ways around Krell's orders, and some even considered stepping out of line to save their brothers. Which, in the clone world, is basically a huge deal, because disobeying a Jedi is like, well, the biggest no-no you can imagine. Anyway, this whole mess changed the way clones saw the Jedi forever. Umbara was the moment when a lot of them realized Jedi weren't flawless heroes. Sometimes they could be the monster in the room. Alright, picking up right where we left off. So General Krell starts acting like a bad actor and the clones are stuck in the audience, wondering if they accidentally signed up for a horror show. You've got to remember, clones are bred for one thing: follow orders, no questions asked. That's been hammered into them since before they could even think. So when Krell starts throwing out orders that don't just seem risky, but downright suicidal, the clones are stuck in this weird limbo. Do they keep obeying and probably get themselves killed, or do they risk going against a Jedi, which is basically the biggest no-no imaginable? And here's the thing, the clones aren't dumb. They can see patterns, and the pattern with Krell was ugly. Every time he gave an order, more brothers didn't make it back. They started noticing that Krell wasn't just reckless. He was actively making decisions that got squads wiped out. Like one time, there was this squad pinned down in an open field. Calls for backup went unanswered. Krell just stood there in his command post, watching the carnage like it was some kind of strategy game. You can imagine how that felt if you were one of those clones. Now, the clones weren't exactly sitting around twiddling their thumbs. They talked, a lot, in whispered conversations between patrols, in quiet moments before the next firefight. They questioned Krell. They wondered if he was under some dark influence, because no Jedi normally behaves this way. Some even joked nervously that Krell might have had a Sith subscription or something. It was their way of coping, cracking a joke when the situation was anything but funny. But the real problem was that they couldn't just refuse orders. Jedi were the law, the leaders, the ones who gave the clones their purpose. Disobeying wasn't just dangerous, it was a betrayal. So many clones felt torn, loyalty to the Jedi on one side, and survival instincts screaming on the other. Some of the older, more experienced clones started quietly pushing back. Not open rebellion, but subtle moves, hesitating before rushing into obvious death traps, trying to find safer ways to carry out Krell's commands. It was a dangerous game. You cross a Jedi general like that, and you don't just lose rank, you might lose your life. It wasn't just the physical danger either. The emotional toll was brutal. Clones started to feel like they were no longer brothers fighting side by side, but pawns in some twisted game, controlled by someone who didn't care if they lived or died. The usual camaraderie faded as fear and frustration took hold. You could see it in their eyes, the tiredness that comes from losing friends, and wondering if the next order will be the one that kills you. Some clones who used to be jokesters became silent. Others held onto their sense of humour desperately, like a lifeline. And it didn't help that the Jedi Council was slow to act. Even when rumours about Krell's behaviour started to spread, official reports took time. For weeks, the clones were stuck following orders from a man who was basically their worst enemy. Eventually, Krell was removed from command, but only after the clones had paid a heavy price. Lives lost, morale shattered, and trust broken, not just in one general, but in the Jedi leadership as a whole. After Umbara, things were different for the clones. They learned that Jedi weren't always the heroes they imagined. Some were brilliant and kind, sure, but others, like Krell, could be terrifyingly ruthless. This shook the clone community deeply. Imagine growing up believing you were fighting for a noble cause, only to find out your leaders might not have your best interests at heart. It made some clones cynical, some angry, and others determined to keep fighting anyway, because what choice did they have? But the scars Umbara left weren't just on their bodies. They were on their minds and souls. The betrayal by someone they were supposed to trust was like a crack in their armour that never fully healed. And that, my friend, is why Umbara stands out as one of the darkest chapters in clone trooper history. It was a battle against betrayal, broken trust, and the harsh truth that even the good guys can become monsters. We mentioned before that clones age twice as fast, but that was just the surface. The reality is much harsher. They age way faster than a regular human, like twice as fast, which sounds cool if you're trying to hit the gym and bulk up fast. but not so cool when it means your life is basically on a timer. Imagine being 20 years old, but looking like you're 40, with all the aches, pains, and stress that come with it. That's what the clones were dealing with, and honestly, it sucked. So why the rapid aging? The short answer is, the Kaminoans designed the clones to grow up fast, so they could be ready for battle. Makes sense from a military standpoint. You want soldiers, not babies, but it's a rough deal for the clones themselves. The clones didn't get a normal childhood. One minute they're embryos in a lab, the next they're basically grown men and women thrown straight into grueling training. Their bodies were cranking through development like they were on fast forward. That's not just about looking older either. Their muscles, bones and organs were all maturing rapidly, which sounds impressive, but came with major downsides. Rapid growth puts stress on the body. It's like trying to build a skyscraper in half the usual time. You might get it done quicker, but the structure's not going to be as solid. And here's where the problems started stacking up. Clones experienced fatigue, joint pain and wear and tear way earlier than a regular soldier would. That's not the kind of stuff you want showing up in your early 20s. Plus, their immune systems weren't quite like a normal human's either. Growing fast meant their bodies were more vulnerable to certain illnesses and injuries that might not bother regular humans. So, staying healthy was a constant battle. And medical support on the battlefield wasn't exactly 5-star. Now, you might be thinking, well, they're soldiers, it's all part of the job. And yeah, that's true. But it still puts a damper on the whole being a clone trooper lifestyle. When you know your body's going to start breaking down faster, it changes how you think about the future, or honestly, if there even is a future. There was no retirement plan for clones. No pensions, no take it easy after 30 years of service options. Their built-in expiration date meant most clones were worn out well before their time, sometimes dying not from battle wounds, but from their bodies just giving out. That's a harsh reality to swallow. You're trained, bred and sent off to fight wars, but your clock is ticking faster than anyone else's. It's like being handed a stopwatch and told, good luck out there. Even in the Star Wars universe, that's brutal. You don't get the luxury of aging gracefully, of growing old surrounded by family. The clones were born into service, lived fast, and often died young. And speaking of dying young, the rapid aging also messed with their mental state. Imagine going through so much trauma and battle stress while your body feels like it's already decades older. It's like carrying emotional baggage and physical exhaustion stacked on top of each other. Some clones tried to make light of it, cracking jokes about how they'd beat the aging game or looked old enough to be a general. But underneath the humour was a real fear. Because when your body betrays you and the end feels close, it's hard to stay optimistic. Another thing is, rapid aging limited their usefulness over time. The Republic didn't keep the clones around forever. After a certain point, a clone who started showing signs of accelerated aging or health issues would probably get replaced by a fresher batch. That meant clones were seen as disposable. And hey, if you think about it, that's kind of heartbreaking. These guys fought tooth and nail for the Republic, yet their lives were planned out like a product with an expiration date. They weren't heroes with long legacies, they were tools with a use-by sticker. So, yeah, rapid aging was a double-edged lightsaber. It got the clones ready fast, but it also meant they were on a fast track to burnout and death. Not exactly the kind of thing you want if you're hoping to live a long, peaceful life after the war. In the end, the rapid aging is a perfect example of why being a clone trooper sucked so hard. It's not just the fighting and the constant danger, it's the knowledge that your body is racing against time, and there's no stopping the clock. So, now that we've talked about how clones aged twice as fast and what that meant physically and mentally, let's zoom in on some things you might not have thought about. How rapid aging affected their daily lives, relationships, and even how they saw themselves over time. First off, think about the social stuff. Clones weren't soldiers only. They were also individuals trying to figure out who they were. But when you're aging twice as fast, it messes with your sense of identity. That's tough for anyone. Imagine trying to bond with your fellow clones, who might look like they've been through a dozen wars, even though you all came out of the same batch. It wasn't unusual for clones to joke about who looked the oldest or youngest in their squad, but underneath the humour, there was a real sense of frustration. These guys were supposed to be fighting for a future they might never get to see. Knowing you're aging fast puts a time limit on everything. It's like having a countdown clock on your life and wondering how much time you have left. Now, this rapid aging also had consequences on their families. Well, sort of. Clones didn't really have families growing up. but many of them formed close bonds with other clones. Those relationships were intense because they knew they might lose each other sooner rather than later. Rapid aging made every goodbye feel heavier, every injury more worrying. This fast-forward aging also affected how clones planned, or didn't plan, for the future. Unlike normal people, they couldn't really think, "I'll take it easy and enjoy life in my 40s and 50s. For clones, those ages often came by the time they were in their 20s or 30s. And the mental toll of all this? Huge. Imagine dealing with battle trauma compressed into a much shorter time frame, on top of knowing your body is physically wearing down fast. That's a lot for anyone to handle. Some clones tried to cope by focusing on the mission, keeping their minds busy so they wouldn't think about their bodies breaking down. Others leaned on humor or camaraderie to get through the tough times. Interestingly, rapid aging may have even influenced the clones' personalities and leadership styles. Some clones grew more serious and pragmatic earlier than they might have otherwise, while others clung to youthful optimism for as long as they could. And here's a bit of a twist. Rapid aging also affected the Jedi generals who worked with the clones. Imagine commanding troops who look older than you sometimes, who have the scars and weariness of veterans, but might actually be younger in years. That created a weird dynamic, where respect and authority sometimes had to be earned in unusual ways. Another thing to consider is how rapid aging affected the clones' training and skill development. Since their bodies matured quickly, they had to master combat skills and tactics in a compressed time. There wasn't really room for slow and steady. It was fast learning, fast adapting, and then jumping into combat. This pace meant that some clones never really got a chance to master the softer skills, like diplomacy, negotiation, or leadership, that might come with more time. It was all about survival, fast reflexes, and doing your duty before your body started to break down. And while clones were incredibly skilled, rapid aging meant their physical prime was much shorter. Unlike human soldiers who might peak in their late 20s or early 30s, clones had to peak earlier, then deal with decline setting in just as their experience was growing. That's a cruel irony. You get the brains and skills but lose the physical edge faster than anyone else. Imagine being a sniper whose body starts shaking, or a pilot whose reflexes slow down because your joints ache. The system wasn't designed to support clones past a certain point, so they often faced a hard choice: keep fighting while their bodies failed, or step aside and be replaced, often feeling like they'd been used up and discarded. And if you think about it, this rapid aging was a psychological trap. It reinforced the clones' feelings of being tools or products, rather than people with hopes and dreams. Some clones expressed this frustration openly, questioning the Republic's ethics. Others internalized it, carrying the burden silently while trying to focus on their duty. There's a famous moment in the Clone Wars series where a clone named Rex talks about feeling worn out, tired of the endless fighting and the physical toll it's taking. That's the reality for these guys. Constant war, compounded by their bodies aging faster than nature intended. Finally, rapid aging ties into the bigger story of why clone troopers aren't just faceless soldiers, but individuals with struggles, fears, and hopes, racing against time in a war that doesn't wait. Okay, so you've probably heard about this guy named Fives, right? Not your average soldier. He's the kind of clone who's curious, smart, and, well, not afraid to ask questions. And in the clone world, asking questions can get you in serious trouble. Here's the deal. For a long time, clones believed they were just soldiers following orders, fighting for the Republic and their Jedi generals. What they didn't know, and what the Jedi and Republic certainly weren't telling them, was that every clone had this little secret embedded inside their brains. Inhibitor chips. Yeah, sounds like some sci-fi gadget, but these chips were actually control devices implanted in every clone before they even left Kamino. Their official purpose? Supposedly to keep the clones calm and obedient during battle. But the real kicker, these chips could also make clones turn on their own commanders if activated. Basically, a built-in kill switch. Creepy, right? So, Fives, being the kind of guy who doesn't just take things at face value, started digging around after some really strange incidents during missions. Clones were acting out of character, suddenly turning aggressive towards their Jedi leaders or fellow troopers. It didn't make sense. It was like the clones were being controlled, but by who or what? Nobody knew. Fives wasn't the type to just shrug and move on. He got obsessed with figuring out what was going on. He went to some shady places on Kamino, poked around in secret labs, and even confronted some scientists. Imagine that, one clone going rogue trying to crack the system designed to control him. And man, this guy was smart. He uncovered that these inhibitor chips weren't just calming devices. They were tools for mind control, programmed to make clones obey any order, even orders to kill Jedi or other clones. Basically, a Trojan horse built into their brains. Now, try putting yourself in Fives' boots. You find out that your entire life, your thoughts, your actions, could be overridden by some tiny chip you had no idea existed. Talk about a nightmare. No wonder he freaked out. But here's where it gets worse. You'd think the Republic would want to hear about this, right? Get rid of the chips, protect their soldiers? Nope. Fives tried to warn people, but instead of getting help, he got silenced. Yeah, the higher-ups didn't want this leaking out. This secret could wreck the whole war effort, expose the shady stuff going on behind the scenes. So rather than thanking Fives, they labelled him a traitor, someone gone rogue. His brothers, his own squad, were ordered to arrest him. Imagine that betrayal. Not only does Fives find out he's basically a puppet, but now he's treated like the bad guy by the very people he fought alongside. It's pretty brutal when you think about it. Clones are bred to be loyal, but when loyalty means shutting up about the truth, that's a heavy burden. Fives' story is tragic because he wanted to do the right thing. He wanted to protect his brothers from being controlled like puppets, but in the end, the system crushed him. And here's the real kicker. The inhibitor chips weren't just some weird sci-fi plot device. They were real, active, and deadly. Later on, we see clones like Tup losing control because their chips activated, leading to catastrophic events. Fives' discovery shows just how deep the conspiracy ran. The Republic and the Jedi weren't just fighting the Separatists. They were hiding a dark secret that literally turned clones into ticking time bombs. So yeah, when you think about why it sucked to be a clone trooper, the story of Fives is a perfect example. It's not just about getting shot at or running into blaster fire. It's about finding out you're not really in control of your own mind and then being punished for trying to speak up. Imagine that. It's like being trapped in a game you didn't know you signed up for. And when you try to quit, the system locks the door. That's heavy stuff. And it's exactly why the clones' lives were way more complicated than just marching into battle. Alright, so we left off with Fives discovering this crazy secret about the inhibitor chips. Those tiny things in every clone's head that could basically hijack their minds and make them do things they'd never choose on their own. It's like finding out your brain's got a little switch someone else can flip anytime they want. That's pretty much a nightmare, right? So, after Fives digs up this ugly truth, what happens? You'd hope he'd be treated like the guy who saved the day, or at least someone the Republic would listen to. But nope, it turns into a whole other mess. See, the Republic and the Jedi Council didn't want this secret out. The chips were a last resort safety measure to keep control over the clones during the chaos of war. But the idea that these chips could make clones kill their Jedi generals, that was a bombshell nobody wanted to explode in public. Instead of support, Fives gets suspicion and hostility. The higher-ups start painting him as unstable, a rogue trooper gone off the rails. His own brothers, those clones he fought beside every day, get orders to arrest him. Imagine that. You're on a mission, trusting your squad, and suddenly the guy who was your buddy is your target. It's like some twisted buddy cop movie where the partner suddenly turns into the bad guy because he found out the truth. Now, Fives didn't give up. He knew the stakes were huge, and that the chips weren't just some sci-fi control gimmick, but a real dangerous threat. So he tries to get to the bottom of it, sneaking around, hacking into systems, even confronting Kaminoan scientists about what the hell was going on. That takes guts because those scientists aren't exactly the friendly neighborhood tech geeks. They're cold, clinical, and totally focused on their cloning project without much care for individual clones. Fives' push to expose the truth made him a target. Meanwhile, the clones around him are torn. Most of them just want to do their job and survive. Some start hearing whispers about the chips, about clones turning on their own Jedi. The paranoia sets in. Who can you trust when your own brain might betray you? Then there's Tup, another clone whose inhibitor chip activates unexpectedly. It causes him to act out violently and lose control, leading to a tragic incident that shakes the ranks. Tup's case isn't isolated. It's proof that these chips aren't just theoretical, they're deadly. Fives' story spreads quietly among clones, creating a mixture of fear confusion, and anger. Some clones question their orders harder than ever. Others suppress those thoughts because the war doesn't stop for philosophical debates. The emotional toll is massive. Imagine being bred your whole life to be a soldier, only to realize that your mind isn't fully yours. It's like being a prisoner inside your own body. And to top it off, when Fives tries to blow the whistle, the system fights back hard. Instead of fixing the problem, they silence him. His brothers come after him, forced to treat their own teammate as an enemy. The betrayal is deep, more than just war casualties. It's personal. For the clones, that moment is a crack in their faith, not just in the Republic or the Jedi, but in their own existence. They wonder, are we really free, or just programmed pawns? It's a dark thought for anyone to carry, especially when the only life you've known is fighting for a cause you believed in. Fives' fate, sadly, doesn't get a happy ending. He pays the price for wanting the truth to come out, but his courage sticks with the clone community, and us as well. A reminder that questioning things, even when it's dangerous, is what separates humans from mindless soldiers. The inhibitor chip conspiracy shows that sometimes the scariest enemies aren't the ones with blasters and droids, but the secrets locked inside you. So next time you think about the clones storming into battle, remember Fives, the clone who dared to ask why and got silenced for it. That's a real story about sacrifice, loyalty, and the brutal cost of war. Alright, buckle up because this one's heavy. You've spent years fighting side by side with your Jedi General. You respect this person, maybe you even look up to them. Maybe they saved your life once or twice. Maybe you share jokes between battles. They're not just your commander, they're your friend. Then out of nowhere, you get the order. Execute Order 66 sounds like some cold official command, but to you, it's like being told, go kill the person who's been your brother in arms, the one you trusted the most. And there's no warning or a chance to ask why, no time to even think. Imagine that. One moment you're fighting side by side, and the next you're supposed to turn your blaster on someone you cared about. No, hey, this is complicated, or let's talk it out, just a hard command to follow. And in the clone world, following orders isn't optional. You might say, well, clones are programmed to obey orders. And yeah, they were engineered for obedience. But that doesn't mean there wasn't a human or clone part inside them struggling with what they had to do. Because you can be programmed to obey, but that doesn't erase the memories, the bonds, or the grief that hits afterward. So, what was it like for them? There's no big dramatic showdown. Most of the time, it was fast, brutal, and cold. You're mid-mission, and suddenly your comm buzzes with Order 66. The Jedi you've trusted your whole life goes from leader to target in a blink. Maybe you hesitate for a split second. Maybe you don't. But the order is clear. Some clones fired without thinking, because their training kicked in. Others might have looked at their Jedi with confusion, maybe even horror, but their blaster went up anyway. And then the aftermath. Oh man, the aftermath. Some clones tried to make sense of it. They asked, why did this happen? Why did we have to kill our own friends? But there was no answer from the Republic. The Jedi were labeled traitors. The clones were expected to move on and keep fighting, this time without the Jedi. No time for grief, no time for guilt, but inside, it tore them up. For some clones, it was a numb kind of pain, like losing a family member, but being told you can't cry or mourn because the war still rages on. For others, guilt hung around like a shadow. You can't just erase years of camaraderie and respect overnight. The truth is, many clones probably never got over it. They had no real chance to process the betrayal, the loss, or the guilt. The Republic moved fast, and so did the war. That rapid pace left little room for healing, and to make things worse, the clones had no say in it. They didn't push for it. They were given a secret code buried deep in their brains. Remember those inhibitor chips? Yeah, those things were activated to make sure clones obeyed without question. So some of them might have felt like they weren't even themselves that day. Like a switch flipped, and they were forced to turn on their friends. It's hard to imagine what that must have done to a clone's mind. A few clones like Captain Rex resisted the order, at least for a while. They started questioning what was happening, but even for them, the guilt and confusion were heavy. Imagine carrying the weight of having to betray your brother, then fighting to hold on to your own sense of self. The whole Order 66 event wasn't just a tactical maneuver for the Empire, it was a psychological earthquake for the clones. It broke the foundation of trust they'd built with the Jedi. It fractured their sense of loyalty. It left scars that never fully healed. And here's the kicker. After all that, most clones just kept going. They kept fighting for the new regime, for the Empire, for orders, because that's what they were made to do. But inside it must have felt like they were ghosts of who they used to be. So yeah, the day you killed your friend, it was a nightmare wrapped in a command, a moment that shattered bonds, and a reminder that sometimes being a clone trooper meant doing the unthinkable. So, you executed your Jedi General, your friend, and then what? What happens next? Well, spoiler, there wasn't a moment to breathe, because the war didn't stop. The galaxy was shifting, sure, but the battles kept coming. The Separatists were defeated, but the Empire was rising, and the clones were still expected to be soldiers. And the irony? They were fighting for an empire that was basically the enemy of everything they'd been trained to protect. Imagine that mental dissonance. Some clones dealt with it by switching off their feelings, burying all the guilt and grief deep down where no one could see it. They'd joke among themselves, sometimes darkly, like, well, Jedi or not, you got to follow orders, otherwise what's the point? Others couldn't handle it so easily. Some started questioning everything. Their purpose, their loyalty, even their own existence. A few brave clones tried to resist. Captain Rex, for example, pulled off his inhibitor chip and refused to follow that deadly order. But that was rare. Most clones didn't get that choice. The inhibitor chips made sure of it. You've got to imagine the confusion, the horror, the guilt when that chip flipped the switch. 1 second you're fighting side by side with your Jedi friend, and the next your brain is telling you to shoot. Some clones later said it felt like they were watching themselves from the outside, powerless to stop what was happening. What happens when the fighting's done? What happens when you've killed your friend, your leader, and you're left standing alone in the rubble? No one was prepared for that. The Republic didn't send out counselors, and the Empire definitely didn't care. The clones just had to soldier on. That led to all kinds of emotional fallout. Some clones became withdrawn, quiet, maybe even cold. Others lashed out or drank too much during rare off hours. The weight of guilt and loss was heavy, and there wasn't an easy way to put it down. Another thing that's easy to overlook is how the clones' relationships with each other changed. They were bred to be brothers, a tight-knit unit, but Order 66 created cracks in that bond. Some clones wondered if the others really had their backs, or if they'd be forced to turn on each other next. Trust became fragile. The tight squads that once moved as one started to fracture under the pressure of secrets, lies, and the new reality. Meanwhile, the Empire didn't stick with clones forever. Their rapid aging and all that mental baggage made them less ideal for long-term soldiering. So the Empire started recruiting regular humans, stormtroopers, to replace them. That was a punch in the gut for clones who'd given everything for the Republic and then the Empire. Imagine giving your whole life to something, only to be told, thanks, but you're old news now. Some clones accepted the replacement with quiet acceptance. Others felt betrayed all over again, like they were disposable tools used up and tossed aside, and still, the mental scars lingered. The clones knew what they were. They weren't just soldiers, they were products. Tools designed, manufactured, deployed, and discarded. That's a heavy identity to carry. It's like being told you're less than human, and then having to act like you're not broken. But many clones did their best to keep going, to find meaning in their service, despite everything. Some looked for ways to hold on to the past, to keep memories alive of the Jedi they loved, the friends they lost, the battles they won. Others found new purpose in protecting the innocent under the Empire's shadow, even if the system around them had changed. And a few, like Rex and his crew, tried to find ways to break free from the cycle, to carve out their own futures beyond being just soldiers. You've been through every hell the galaxy could throw at you. You're the cream of the crop, a perfectly engineered, battle-tested soldier who's basically the gold standard of military might in the galaxy. And then, one day, without much fanfare or warning, you find out you're basically obsolete. Yeah, overnight you go from being the Republic's best asset to the Empire's old model that needs replacing. Welcome to the not-so-glamorous life of the clone trooper in the era of the stormtrooper. So what happened? Why did the Empire decide to swap out the clones for stormtroopers? These fresh-faced recruits who, let's be honest, often weren't nearly as good. Well, a few things came into play. After a few years of brutal combat and training, your bodies start to wear down. Knees ache, reflexes slow, injuries heal slower, or sometimes don't heal at all. The Empire didn't want to keep throwing good money at cloning facilities and medical care for soldiers who who were getting old before their time. It just wasn't sustainable. On top of that, cloning itself was crazy expensive and complicated. Kaminoans had the process down, but it took time and resources. And the Empire? They wanted an army that could grow fast and cheap, so they turned to regular humans. Enter the stormtroopers. Stormtroopers were recruits, soldiers conscripted, trained and deployed, but without the super soldier status or genetic enhancements of clones. Sure, clones were more reliable, more disciplined, and frankly, more battle-ready. Stormtroopers? Let's just say their aim wasn't exactly legendary. But from the Empire's point of view, numbers mattered more than quality, and that meant more stormtroopers, less clones. Now, for the clones themselves, this was a kick in the teeth. Imagine busting your guts for the Republic, fighting wars non-stop, losing brothers in arms, and then getting told, "Thanks for your service, but you're old news now." It was like being the star athlete on the team, only to be benched in favour of rookies who hadn't yet learned how to tie their boots. And to make it worse, clones weren't just told to step aside. They were often pushed out quietly, with little thanks or recognition. No parades, no celebrations of their service, just a slow fade into the background as stormtroopers took over. Some clones took it personally. After all, they were designed to be perfect soldiers, bred for war. Being replaced felt like a rejection, not just of their skills, but of their very identity. Others understood it was just the way things went. Technology moves fast and so does war. You get replaced, you move on. But you can bet that on the inside, many clones felt bitter. They knew the stormtroopers often weren't as good or as loyal. The stormtroopers didn't share the same camaraderie, the same history, or the same sense of purpose. And here's the truth. For all the blaster misses and clumsy formations, stormtroopers represented something the Empire liked better: control. Unlike clones, stormtroopers weren't genetically programmed to obey without question. They were trained, yes, but they had free will, which might sound like a good thing until you realize the Empire used fear, indoctrination, and harsh discipline to keep them in line. Stormtroopers were more replaceable and less tied to the old Republic ideals. They were blank slates shaped to serve the Empire's agenda. So the transition from clones to stormtroopers wasn't just about efficiency or cost. It was political. It was symbolic. It marked the Empire's break from the past, the Republic and the Jedi, and a new era where soldiers were tools of fear and control, rather than brotherhood and loyalty. Now you might wonder how clones felt seeing stormtroopers take their place. Mixed emotions mostly. Some probably felt relieved to get out of the endless fighting. Their bodies were breaking down, their minds tired. A break sounded nice, even if it came with some bitterness. Others struggled with a sense of loss and irrelevance. After all, their whole lives had been about being soldiers, about fighting for something bigger. Suddenly that role was slipping away. There are stories of clones who tried to adapt, finding new roles, working behind the scenes, or even joining the rebellion against the Empire. But many just faded away, forgotten by history. It's sad, really. The clones were the backbone of the Republic's army, the perfect soldiers created to fight impossible wars. And yet, the very qualities that made them special, obedience, loyalty, skill, weren't enough to keep them relevant in the new regime. Being replaced by stormtroopers meant losing not just a job, but an identity. To sum it up, clones went from being elite, irreplaceable warriors to obsolete relics almost overnight. It wasn't just a career change, it was a harsh reminder that in war and in life, nothing lasts forever. So, you've been replaced. The Empire brought in stormtroopers, fresh recruits with new uniforms, new gear, and a whole different vibe. Meanwhile, you and your brothers, well, you're left to figure out what comes next. And spoiler, it's not exactly a walk in the park. First off, let's talk about the day-to-day reality for clones after the switch. Some clones found themselves sidelined, pushed out of the frontline action they were bred for. They might get assigned to training roles, helping the new stormtroopers get their act together, which, let's be honest, probably felt weird, like tutoring your own replacements. Others were reassigned to security details, overseeing prisoner transports or guarding Imperial facilities. Not exactly the glory missions they trained for on Kamino, but hey, it's a job. And some clones found themselves unemployed without a clear role. That kind of blow hits harder than a blaster bolt. Now, physically, the clones were starting to feel their age too. The rapid aging means their bodies weren't what they used to be. The armor didn't fit quite right anymore. their reflexes slowed, and the endless missions had taken a toll. Trying to keep up with younger stormtroopers was tough. The energy was different, the pace was different, and for clones who prided themselves on being the best, that had to sting. But it wasn't just physical. Mentally and emotionally, clones faced a storm of challenges. They were wrestling with the fact that their entire lives had been shaped for a war that was effectively over for them. The Republic was gone, the Jedi were gone, and now the Empire was calling the shots. For many clones, that created an identity crisis. Who were they, if not soldiers for the Republic? What did it mean to be a clone trooper in the Empire's shadow? Some clones tried to adapt by embracing the Empire's new order. They suited up, followed orders, and tried to find meaning in serving a new cause. Maybe it wasn't the Republic, but it was still an army, still discipline, still brotherhood. Others quietly rejected it. They couldn't stomach serving the Empire. Some went rogue, joining the growing rebellion, or simply disappearing into the galaxy. There were even cases of clones who banded together, forming small groups of veterans trying to carve out a life outside of the Empire's control. You have to respect that. After being bred for war, clones had to learn to be civilians, or at least something close to it, in a galaxy that barely remembered them. And let's be real, that transition must have been brutal. Imagine spending your entire life in armor, drilled to obey, and suddenly you're out of uniform. You've lost your purpose, your family, your place. That's a recipe for loneliness, confusion, and maybe a bit of bitterness. And you know what made it worse? The galaxy didn't really care. Stormtroopers got all the spotlight, their shiny helmets marching across planets, their new uniforms appearing in holonews broadcasts, their loyalty hailed by Imperial propaganda. Clones? They became a footnote. The old army, no one talked about, and that invisibility hurt, because clones weren't just soldiers, they were individuals, with stories, personalities, and struggles. But the Empire's story didn't have room for nuance or nostalgia. They wanted obedient troops who didn't ask questions, didn't have histories, and didn't carry emotional baggage. Stormtroopers fit that mold perfectly. Clones? Not so much. So many clones spent their later years watching the world move on without them, sometimes feeling like ghosts of a past war. Still, many clones held on to pride in what they'd done. They were the backbone of the Republic's army, the best soldiers the galaxy had ever seen. And even if the Empire moved on, clones knew their legacy mattered. Some clones found ways to remind themselves and others of that legacy, sharing stories, training the next generation, or simply surviving day by day. Because survival was the name of the game. Alright, so we've talked about the clones who stayed in, the ones who got pushed out, and the ones who didn't even get a proper goodbye. But what about the guys who escaped? The ones who managed to break out of the system before it could chew them up completely? Let's talk about the small handful of clones who slipped through the cracks. The forgotten few, if you want to call them that. Sounds kind of cool, like some underground resistance. But honestly, their stories are more sad and awkward than anything. Let's start with Cutlaw Quain. This guy ditched the army way before it was trendy. Way back during the Clone Wars, he just left, walked away from the war, found himself a quiet little planet, settled down, started a family. He married a Twi'lek woman, raised a couple kids and started farming, straight up space dad. And yeah, on the surface that sounds peaceful, almost like a happy ending. But imagine being trained from birth to be a soldier, living by orders, sleeping with one eye open. And then suddenly, your biggest problem is crop rotation and teaching your kids how to brush their teeth. That's a massive gear shift. Cut had to unlearn everything the Kaminoans drilled into him. He had to figure out how to be a husband, a dad, a neighbour, not a clone, not CT, whatever, just Cut. And that's hard. You're not just dropping a job, you're dropping your entire identity. And he had to hide, like always, because if the Empire found out he was an AWOL clone, game over. So no armour, no Republic ID, no public trips to the grocery store with, "Hello, I'm a genetically identical super soldier" energy. He got by, he made it work, but you gotta wonder, how many nights did he lie awake thinking about the brothers he left behind? About the ones who didn't make it out? I mean, survivor's guilt hits hard when you actually survived. Now let's talk about Gregor. Oh man, Gregor's story is a mess. So during the Clone Wars, Gregor ends up crashing on some random desert planet, loses his memory, gets taken in by some alien diner owner, because apparently there's always a diner in Star Wars, and becomes a dishwasher. That's right, clone commando to short order cook. And he doesn't even remember who he is at first, just scrubbing dishes, flipping food, living this weird, simple life until someone shows up and jogs his memory. And even then, instead of running off and disappearing into the stars, Gregor jumps right back into battle like it's Taco Tuesday and the galaxy's on fire. He ends up surviving again somehow. He pops up years later with Rex and Wolf, hiding out in the middle of nowhere. And yeah, he's a little off. Dude talks like he's had too many concussions and not enough sleep, but honestly, you can't blame him. He went through a lot, and that's kind of the point here. Escaping didn't mean living happily ever after. It meant trading one kind of trauma for another. Rex is maybe the best example of that. He pulled his chip out and ran, ended up hiding out with the others, growing a beard, doing whatever odd jobs would keep them fed and unnoticed. And yet, you could tell he never stopped carrying the weight of it all. He tried to help. He joined up with the Ghost crew for a bit, fought the Empire when he could, but you could always see it in his eyes, that tension. Like he never got over what happened, like he was stuck between being a soldier and being a man who couldn't stop replaying the moment he almost killed Ahsoka. Even in hiding, even in freedom, the guilt followed them. They all lost something. Their purpose, their brothers, their health, their sanity. Some lost everything and kept going like nothing happened, which honestly makes them even more impressive and more tragic. And the thing is, for every Rex or Gregor or Cut that we do know about, there are probably dozens of other clones who escaped and we never heard from again. Maybe some tried to live quiet lives, maybe some didn't make it very far, maybe some just disappeared into the galaxy. The point is, the ones who got out weren't lucky, not really. They had freedom, sure, but freedom without direction, without healing? That's just isolation with extra steps. The war might have ended, but for these guys, the fight never really stopped. It just got quieter, lonelier, and harder to explain to anyone who hadn't lived it. So yeah, when people talk about the clone troopers and say, well, at least some of them escaped. Yeah, maybe, but escape wasn't the finish line. It was just another kind of survival, and survival is exhausting. Alright, I think by now we've felt what it was actually like to be a clone trooper. And yeah, it was tough, but now the war's over. The Republic is gone, the Empire has taken over, and Palpatine just played the entire galaxy. You're not a clone trooper anymore, you're a stormtrooper, and let's be honest, this is probably the part where you start forgetting how to aim. See, clone training on Kamino was like boot camp on steroids, with a side of genetic programming. They were drilled from birth, literally, living in training facilities, running obstacle courses, practicing blaster drills before they hit puberty. By the time they hit the battlefield, they already had years of combat experience, teamwork, and basically a sixth sense for battle. Clone training was a lifelong commitment. The clones lived and breathed it every day. Physical conditioning, weapons drills, hand-to-hand combat, survival skills, teamwork, all built into their DNA, kind of literally. They had holo projections, simulations, endless obstacle courses that tested their limits, and Jedi mentors to guide them in tactics and strategy. The Empire's training, more like get through it as fast as possible, then get out there and shoot stuff. They didn't have time or resources to train every recruit for years. They needed bodies and they needed them yesterday. That meant stormtrooper training was condensed into a few months, maybe less in some places. Physical training was still rough, don't get me wrong. Recruits had to run, carry heavy gear, learn to march for hours in armor that's hot as Tatooine midday, and stay in shape enough to keep up with missions. But it wasn't the kind of grinding, relentless challenge clones faced day in, day out for their whole lives. The biggest focus was discipline. Stormtroopers were drilled to obey orders without question. Think of it like the military version of just do what I say, don't think about it. There was no room for hesitation, no time for second guessing, and that meant a lot of psychological pressure. The Empire wanted stormtroopers to be obedient first, skilled second. Weapons training was another big difference. Clones were sharpshooters by design, trained to aim, to anticipate, to work as a unit with Jedi commanders. Stormtroopers, they learned to shoot, but their reputation for terrible aim, yeah, that's kind of deserved. That's not to say they were completely hopeless, but most stormtroopers weren't trained to be snipers or expert marksmen. They were suppressing fire units, meant to overwhelm the enemy with numbers, not precision. And the variety of stormtrooper units, scout troopers, snow troopers, shock troopers, got specialized training, but even that specialized training was sped up compared to the clones' years of practice. It was more, here's what you need to know to not die today, than here's how to be a master of your craft. Another thing clones probably noticed was the lack of camaraderie. Clones grew up together, shared the same genes, trained side by side for years, fought as brothers. Stormtroopers, on the other hand, were thrown together after a few weeks of training, sometimes shuffled around from unit to unit. That meant trust wasn't automatic. Sure, they learned to work as a team, but it wasn't the same unbreakable bond clones had. And when things got messy, that lack of deep connection could be a real problem. And the turnover rate? High. Stormtrooper units lost a lot of people fast, which meant new recruits constantly cycled in, making it even harder to build that brotherhood vibe. From the clones' perspective, watching these new guys hit the field after years of grueling training probably felt like watching a rookie football team play against professionals. It wasn't that stormtroopers weren't capable, it was that they hadn't been molded, shaped and sharpened over years like clones had. And then there's the armor. Kamino clones had custom-fit gear designed for their bodies. Stormtroopers got mass-produced armor that often didn't fit quite right, was uncomfortable, and bonus, made it hard to see or breathe sometimes. You think running drills is hard? Try doing it in armor that fogs up your helmet and weighs a ton. The Empire knew this too. They cared less about individual skill and more about overwhelming force, intimidation, and strict discipline. So they pushed stormtroopers to act as a uniform wall of power, not as elite individual warriors. So yeah, stormtrooper training was harsh in its own way. Fast, strict, unforgiving. But it wasn't designed to make the best soldiers. It was designed to make lots of soldiers, quickly, who followed orders without asking questions. And if you were a clone watching that, you probably felt like your years of pain and training were getting shrugged off like yesterday's ration pack. But that was the Empire's way. Volume and obedience over quality and camaraderie. Okay, so we've talked about the basics. Stormtrooper training was quick, intense in some ways, but definitely not clone-level intense. But what did that actually mean for the recruits day to day? What was their experience beyond the obvious, wake up early, run, shoot, repeat? First off, the recruits came from everywhere. Not just Corellia or the Outer Rim, but all corners of the galaxy. So you'd have folks who grew up in city sprawls, desert farms, or mining colonies. They brought with them their own culture, their own habits, and yeah, sometimes their own bad attitudes. This melting pot of backgrounds was both a blessing and a curse. On one hand, you got diversity, which was useful. On the other hand, you had to break down those differences quickly, so everyone could march to the same drum. That meant a lot of basic discipline training. Your culture doesn't matter here, soldier. This is the Empire's army. Morning routines started early, sometimes before the twin suns even peeked over the horizon. The alarm would blast, and you'd jump out of whatever cramped bunk you were assigned to, scramble into your armor, which, by the way, was a whole production in itself. Stormtrooper armor wasn't exactly custom-fitted, more like one size fits most, and if you were tall, short, or in between, expect some discomfort. Put on the helmet, strap in the utility belt, grab the blaster, and head to the training yard. The yard was where the real grind began. Physical training was intense but straightforward. Lots of running, obstacle courses, strength exercises. But unlike clones who had years of this behind them, stormtroopers had to cram it all into months. So the trainers pushed hard to build endurance quickly, not finesse. The obstacle course was a beast. Imagine trying to climb ropes, crawl under nets, and leap over walls, all while wearing armor that's hot, heavy, and probably scratching you in places you didn't know existed. You'd sweat buckets, your helmet fogs up, and your boots feel like they weigh twice as much as they should. And it wasn't just physical. Mental endurance got tested too. Drill sergeants screamed orders, insulted your mother, and made sure you learned fast that questioning authority was a bad idea. It was less about leadership development and more about teaching obedience. Weapons training was another story. The recruits spent hours at the firing range, learning to handle the E11 blaster rifle. They learned how to fire in bursts, maintain the weapon, and reload under pressure. But there wasn't much time to become expert marksmen. The Empire wanted stormtroopers who could hit a general target area, keep suppressive fire on point, and move in formation, not snipers. This is where the famous stormtrooper aim myth probably got its start. Most troopers weren't trained for precision shooting, just volume. They were the blaster equivalent of a shotgun spray. Cover a wide area with blaster bolts and hope something hits. Besides shooting, recruits were drilled in basic squad tactics. How to form ranks, when to advance, how to fall back. The focus was on moving as a unit. Individual initiative was discouraged. If you start thinking for yourself, you might not last long in the Empire's army. But it wasn't all work and no play. When possible, recruits tried to bond with their squad mates. Those short training periods and frequent reassignments made strong friendships hard to come by. It was a revolving door of faces. Compare that to clone troopers, who trained and fought together from childhood. Clones had a built-in family. Stormtroopers had, well, comrades who might be gone next week. Another big pain point? The armour itself. Stormtrooper armour was infamous for being uncomfortable, restrictive, and hard to see through. Training in that stuff made everything harder. Running, climbing, shooting, all were made more difficult with a helmet that fogged up and a suit that didn't breathe. Plus, it was a nightmare when the weather got hot. Sweating inside a plastic suit. Imagine trying to stay cool on a desert world like Tatooine. Stormtroopers had to push through that. Specialised units got slightly better gear and training. Scout troopers got lighter armour and more advanced training in reconnaissance. Snow troopers trained to handle extreme cold, but for most stormtroopers, it was the same mass-produced gear and basic training. So, yeah, the training was harsh, fast, and designed to make soldiers who followed orders, not thinkers. They weren't clones, they were humans pressed into service, trained fast, and expected to hold the Empire's line. From the clones' perspective, watching these guys go into battle, you'd probably think, man, they've got a rough road ahead. No years of shared experience, no perfect reflexes, just a few months of drill sergeants, yelling and hope. So, you finished your training. You're officially a stormtrooper. Congratulations. Yeah, not quite, because now comes the real part, being deployed. And let's be honest, that's when most stormtroopers found out just how underprepared they really were. You might have marched well in formation, passed the firing range test, and kept your helmet from falling off. But when you hit your first real assignment, whole different beast. Suddenly you're not on some training field anymore. You're in a city filled with angry civilians, or on a jungle planet swarming with rebel cells, or in a mining colony where people really hate your face. Stormtroopers weren't trained for context, they were trained for compliance. They didn't learn diplomacy, they weren't taught how to read a room. Their orders were often, hold this checkpoint, clear this sector, put down that protest. So now you've got these fresh recruits, barely out of boot camp, trying to enforce the Empire's will on places they don't understand, and people who absolutely don't want them there. Awkward doesn't even begin to cover it. A lot of early missions were a mix of confusion and chaos. Some of the recruits weren't even sure what the local laws were. They just followed whatever command shouted loudest. Sometimes they used too much force, sometimes they froze up. And if something went wrong, the brass didn't care who messed up. The squad took the blame as a unit. And if you think clones rolled their eyes seeing stormtroopers train, imagine how they felt watching them on deployment. Clones knew how to adapt. They were trained to think tactically, improvise, even lead when the Jedi were unavailable. They understood war in a way that went beyond orders. Stormtroopers? Most of them were figuring it out as they went, which would be fine in a smaller war. But this was the Empire. Mistakes didn't just cost a mission. They got people demoted, reassigned, or worse. Now imagine you're one of those new troopers. You land on some outpost in the mid-rim. The weather sucks, the food's worse, and your commanding officer is a guy who's never seen real combat but shouts like he has. You don't know your squad that well, because half of them were rotated in last week, and the other half, well, they're just hoping you don't screw up, because they've already seen what happens when someone does. You get orders to patrol a sector that's been quiet for weeks, but there's a lot of tension in the air. The locals stare daggers at you. You're sweating in your armour, helmet fogged up again, trying to remember whether the last briefing said anything about potential rebels hiding in the area. But no one's asking questions. You just march forward. This is where the cracks really started to show in the whole stormtrooper system. Clone troopers worked like muscle memory. You gave them a battlefield, they figured it out fast. Cover, squad movement, sightlines. Stormtroopers, they needed more direction. Without it, things fell apart quick. And then you had the equipment failures. The E11 blaster was fine when it worked, but some of them jammed, some overheated, and maintenance, good luck. The support crews were often overwhelmed, and you didn't always get replacement parts. Armor got dented, visors got scratched. Nobody had the time or budget to keep gear in perfect condition. Also, the Empire wasn't big on therapy, in case you were wondering. You weren't expected to talk about trauma. If your squad mate died in front of you, well, shake it off, trooper. There's a new deployment tomorrow. No mourning period and no support. So, morale started dropping, and you can't build loyalty to the Empire on fear and discomfort alone. Some stormtroopers started questioning things. Quietly, of course. You don't exactly bring that up in the mess hall, but in the quiet parts of the transport ride, or in the late hours of patrol, some of them started thinking, is this what we trained for? Now, not everyone broke down or bailed. Some stormtroopers were loyal to the bone, either because they genuinely believed in the Empire, or because they just didn't see another option. And others? They stuck around because, well, what else were they going to do? It's not like there was a retirement plan, or a way out that didn't involve disappearing. But even the best stormtroopers felt the pressure. They were in a system that didn't give them the same tools, support, or respect the clones had, but still expected them to hold the galaxy together. Yeah, the training was only the beginning. Once the missions started rolling in, that's when most stormtroopers realized they weren't elite warriors. They were cogs in a huge machine, and the machine didn't care how well oiled they were. So, picture this. You've been in the stormtrooper ranks for a while. You haven't died, which is already a bit of a miracle. You've followed orders, marched in 100 parades, stood guard at 30 checkpoints, probably sweated out half your body weight inside that white plastic oven they call armor. And now, finally, someone higher up notices you didn't screw up. Congratulations, trooper. You've been promoted to officer. You'd think this is where things get better, right? You've earned it. Maybe you imagine yourself in one of those crisp grey uniforms, standing with your arms behind your back, like you're about to say something important to a room full of cadets. That dream lasts about 5 minutes, because being an officer in the Empire, it's like winning a pie-eating contest and finding out the prize is more pie. But now the pie's on fire, and you're responsible for feeding it to a battalion that hates your guts. Here's how it usually went. Your first promotion was probably to squad leader. That means you're still wearing the armor, still marching, still eating those flavorless ration cubes. But now, when something goes wrong, it's your fault. You're still taking the same blaster fire, but now you also get to babysit 5 or 6 other guys who may or may not remember the briefing. You're the one who has to answer when someone forgets to secure their ammo, or when Private Malkin accidentally stuns a civilian. You remember Malkin? Guy with the always sweaty gloves? Yeah, he's your problem now. As you move up, platoon leader, unit commander, whatever the rank ladder says, the gear gets nicer, sure. Maybe they swap your helmet for a fancy officer cap. You get a data pad. Your bunk gets a real mattress, kind of. But the trade-off? You're now stuck between 2 nightmares. Command from above and chaos from below. High command treats you like a tool. Not a person, not a thinker, just a movable chess piece with a name. They love to send vague, impossible orders from orbit and expect you to execute them with maximum compliance. Meanwhile, your troops are tired, poorly trained, and half of them are questioning why they're even here in the first place. And you're the middleman. You're the one who has to make this work with barely any resources, no backup, and maybe a supply officer who thinks sending 1 crate of rations for 20 guys is fine. You also now have to pretend you know what you're doing. Always. You can't show doubt. You can't ask dumb questions. And trust me, there will be dumb questions. Like, sir, how do we set up this perimeter when we only have 2 troopers and a broken sensor beacon? Or, sir, are we supposed to shoot the people or just scare them? Good luck explaining that when all you were told was, establish peace. And the worst part? The meetings. Oh, force the meetings. Nobody tells you that the higher you go in the ranks, the more time you spend in hollow briefings that go absolutely nowhere. Long-winded status reports, vague strategic objectives, half of it in bureaucratic language that feels like it was written by a malfunctioning protocol droid. And everyone talks like they're trying to win a promotion based on how many syllables they can fit into one sentence. Meanwhile, you're sitting there thinking, we don't even have working comms, can we please talk about that? But no, The conversations about projected morale curves in Subsector B and how it might impact troop discipline over a 3-cycle span. Yeah, super helpful when your squad's armor filters stopped working and everyone smells like wet boots. Also, and this is a fun one, the second you become an officer, you're suddenly considered expendable and replaceable, but also responsible for everything. So when a mission fails, you catch the blame. When it succeeds, High Command takes the credit. Not to mention other officers, not exactly a welcoming crew. There's a lot of ego, a lot of "I trained under Commander so-and-so" nonsense. You'll run into people who've never left their ships acting like they know more about ground ops than you do. And somehow, they outrank you. And don't even think about speaking up or pushing back. This is the Empire. Dissent gets noticed. And not in a, "wow, what a free thinker" kind of way. More like, keep talking and you'll be demoted to sanitation on a Star Destroyer. So yeah, congrats, officer. You've gone from being cannon fodder with a helmet to cannon fodder with a clipboard. You've made it. You've got a desk. Congratulations. The armor's gone, the dirt's gone. And instead of running drills, you're running numbers. You've got a nice smooth desk, a clean uniform, a real chair, and your blaster, it's probably locked in a drawer somewhere you haven't opened in weeks. Sounds good, right? Well, that depends on whether or not you enjoy watching entire towns disappear because of something you ordered. See, the thing nobody tells you is that sitting behind a desk in the Empire, it's weirdly horrifying because you're not watching the war, you're managing it. You're the guy who sends the signal, approves the strike, moves a number on a screen that just happens to be a garrison full of people. And if you mess up, people die, like lots of them, civilians, troopers, everyone. At first it doesn't feel real, it's all holograms and charts. You're zooming in on heat signatures, troop clusters, infrastructure maps. You're reviewing damage percentages like you're grading homework. You get used to reading population counts, like their traffic reports. You say stuff like, "We had to level the outpost, collateral was within limit," and you forget that collateral was somebody's family, somebody's town, somebody's whole planet. You start skipping over words like village and replacing them with non-compliant zone. You dehumanize without even trying. And yeah, you tell yourself, "Well, I didn't pull the trigger. I didn't fire the shot." But deep down, you know that's just a lie you say to sleep at night. You approved it, you greenlit it, and then you went to lunch. You sit there at your terminal, watching icons blink off a screen. 1 second it's a blinking dot labelled Outpost Alrec. Next thing you know, it's just gone. Replaced by a red X. You know what resolved means. There's a part of you that remembers being a trooper, being out there, boots on the ground, hearing the screams, the chaos, seeing people get vaporized by a miscalculated airstrike. You remember what it felt like when you were the one dodging the shrapnel. And now you're the one who just approved the strike that did the same to someone else. And the people around you, they don't talk about it, not really. Not unless it's over drinks late at night, when the hangar's quiet and there's no brass around. Then maybe someone will say something like, "Did you hear about what happened on Garrel? Whole town flattened." And someone else will go, "Yeah, it happens. It happens. It's all part of keeping order," they say. You've got to secure the region. You've got to send a message. But it never sits right. Not really. Especially when you realize half of these so-called resistance movements are just starving locals who didn't like being taxed into oblivion by a governor who never left his palace. But hey, command says they're a threat, so you bomb the village. And even if you try to speak up, you get told to shut up and follow protocol. You start poking your head up too far. You find yourself reassigned to an unfavorable post, maybe even a courtroom, or worse, you just disappear. People do, from time to time. So most folks at your level, they stop asking, they stop thinking, they just run the numbers, check the boxes, and pass the next task along. The galaxy burns, and you file the paperwork. You start living two lives. In one, you're just doing your job, managing data, assigning units, approving missions, following orders. In the other, you're the guy who just got 2 squads wiped out by sending them into a trap. Because your recon data was old, and no one higher up cared, you become numb. Because the moment you stop being numb, you're toast, either mentally or politically. It gets weird when you start seeing things go wrong that you know could have been avoided. You read reports where stormtroopers walk into ambushes because they were given bad coordinates. Coordinates you tried to flag, but got overridden. You see logistics fall apart, supplies not show up, medics stretched too thin. But you're not allowed to fix it. You're allowed to pass it up the chain and hope. And hope isn't a strategy, not in the Empire. After a while, you start to realize something that hits harder than any battlefield injury you ever took. You're part of the reason it's broken now. You're no longer a soldier fighting for your brothers. You're a spreadsheet jockey making decisions for people you'll never meet. You're not in the trenches anymore. You're running the machine that keeps grinding them up. And the worst part, somewhere out there, a clone, maybe one of the last ones left, is looking at this galaxy and thinking, this isn't what we were built for. Alright, so let's talk about what it was actually like to live on the Death Star. Because once you were stationed there, you weren't exactly hopping back to Coruscant on weekends for brunch. To start, let's go back a bit. If you'd served during the days of the Republic, even as a clone trooper, your life was different. It was a different time. You fought with Jedi, not against them. You had commanders who knew your name. You shared bunks with your batch brothers, trained with them, laughed with them, even if it was under a grey Kaminoan sky. You didn't have much freedom, but you had a purpose, and people who genuinely tried to lead you with some level of respect. Now fast forward to the Empire, and they stick you on the Death Star. From the outside, it looks like this massive symbol of Imperial dominance. A moon-sized fortress, all clean metal and brutal power. But once you're actually inside, yeah, not exactly a luxury cruise. First off, the layout is a nightmare. It's like living inside a giant corporate office building that's also a war machine. Every corridor looks the same. Endless grey walls, blinking lights, and sliding doors that always seem to close too slow or too fast. There's no in-between. You better memorize your section, because if you get turned around in the maintenance levels, good luck. You'll be halfway to the garbage compactor before you realize you're lost. Speaking of which, don't get caught in the wrong sector without the right clearance. The Empire doesn't play. There's no oops on the Death Star. If you accidentally walk into the wrong hangar or bump into the wrong officer, that could be the end of your shift or your life. Now, let's talk about the living conditions. For stormtroopers, it's pretty rough. You get your standard issue bunk, probably in a stacked dorm with 40 other guys who all snore like wampers. There's no natural light, no windows, no fresh air, just the hum of machinery and the occasional loudspeaker announcing some security drill you weren't warned about. You wake up to alarms, not sunrise. You go to sleep under flickering fluorescence. And if the environmental controls glitch, which they do, sometimes you're freezing in full armor while brushing your teeth. The food? Bland, mass-produced nutrient bricks. You might get some watery stew if the kitchen droids are feeling fancy, but don't count on it. You start to miss field rations. That's how bad it gets. There's a mess hall, sure, but don't expect laughter and storytelling like back in the clone barracks. Most people eat in silence. Everyone's tense. You don't really talk on the Death Star unless you have to, and if you joke at the wrong moment or with the wrong person listening, you might get reassigned to latrine duty, or worse, questioned by the ISB, Imperial Security Bureau. They're like the galaxy's worst hall monitors, but with blasters and unlimited authority. Their whole job is to sniff out disloyalty, which basically means if you say one thing that even slightly sounds like you're not 100% in love with the Empire, you vanish. Sometimes for questioning, sometimes for good. So people walk on eggshells, even the officers. No one wants to be noticed. The safest trooper on the Death Star is the one who says the least, asks no questions, and files every report exactly how command wants it. And that's just the social vibe. Let's talk about the constant anxiety of knowing you're living on a giant floating time bomb. Everyone says it's invincible, the most powerful weapon in the galaxy, but you can't help but notice the amount of safety drills that happen. The shield systems run regular containment simulations. The reactor core has its own department just for stabilizing spikes, and maintenance droids are always crawling through the walls like something's about to break. You know how, on a starship, at least you feel like you can leave in an escape pod if something goes wrong? On the Death Star, you're the escape pod. If anything goes south, you're just gone. There's no abandoned base. There's no nearby moon to run to. If it blows, it takes you and your grandkids with it. And sure, there's recreation rooms. Some troopers try to relax by playing didgeridoo or watching old holonet flicks. But most of the time, you're just counting shifts and hoping the next one doesn't involve an inspection by some Sith guy who can kill people by thinking too hard. And that's the other thing. The higher-ups, they don't talk to you. They talk through you. You might get barked at by a lieutenant or get shoved aside by an admiral's escort droid, but you don't exist to them. You're a body in armor. And if Darth Vader walks by, you hold your breath. And if he stops walking, well, don't move. Don't even think. Just hope he's not in a mood. Let me tell you about that shift, going from fighting alongside Anakin Skywalker to taking orders from Darth Vader. And yeah, it was as weird as it sounds. If you served during the Clone Wars, you probably worked with Skywalker at some point. He was, well, different from the other Jedi. He'd be the first one to jump into a fight, the last one out. And somewhere in between, he'd probably do something that made your commanding officer shake his head. He was wild sometimes, sure, but you respected him. He didn't treat clones like disposable tools. He got his hands dirty, same as the rest of us. He didn't act like he was above the war. He was in it all the way. You could actually talk to him, joke around even. He liked that. It was this weird balance. He had authority, but he felt like one of us. Then the war ended. Skywalker just wasn't there anymore. The first time I saw him, I thought he was some sort of prototype for a new armor line. Big, tall, heavy steps, the armor completely sealed, with this weird breathing sound that never stopped. He just showed up, took command, and everyone adjusted like it was the most normal thing in the world. You didn't question it. You just followed orders. But if you'd spent time with Anakin, it didn't take long to figure it out. There were things that gave it away. The way he moved, for one. Not exactly the same, but close. Like, too close to be a coincidence. The way he reacted in battle. Still fast, still aggressive, still confident in a way that felt familiar. And then the voice. It was different, yeah, all filtered and mechanical. But sometimes, just sometimes, there was a rhythm to it that made you stop and think, wait a second. And if you did start putting it together, you didn't say anything. Not out loud, not even to people you trusted. That wasn't a conversation you wanted to have in the middle of an Imperial hallway with security cameras and officers walking past. You kept your thoughts to yourself and you followed orders. That's the thing. Vader doesn't explain himself. He gives commands. You don't ask why, you don't request clarification. The guy barely talks unless he needs to. He's not there to bond or give you a pep talk. He's there to make sure the mission gets done, and if it doesn't, someone's going to answer for it. I saw it happen. A trooper hesitated once, just froze up for a second under pressure. Vader didn't yell. He didn't say anything, actually. He just reached out with the force and slammed the guy into a bulkhead like he was nothing. There's no room for mistakes around Vader. You could have been a decorated veteran, fought in 50 battles, saved your squad more times than you can count. None of that matters if you mess up now. The guy you used to laugh with about ration packs and messed up intel is gone. What's left is cold, calculated and dangerous. And yet, in the quiet moments, you still remember. You remember how Skywalker used to fight next to you, not above you. How he'd risk his life to save a clone he barely knew. You remember the guy who didn't act like a Jedi half the time, in a good way. Someone who understood us. Now, every time Vader walks past, you can't help but wonder if some part of that guy is still in there, buried under all the armor and silence. It's not something you dwell on. You can't afford to, because if there is anything left of Skywalker in there, it's not the part that cared about us. Serving under Vader isn't like serving in the Grand Army of the Republic. You don't feel like a soldier in a cause anymore. You feel like you're working for a system that doesn't see you as anything but a tool, a number. You do your job, you keep quiet, and you keep moving forward. And yeah, it stings. You used to be a part of something. Now you're just maintaining the machine. Some of us who've been around long enough, we still swap stories about the war, back when it felt like we were fighting for something. Now it feels like we're just fighting because it's what we were built to do, and Vader's part of that machine. The biggest, scariest part. You don't talk to him, you don't try to get close, you follow his orders, and if you're smart, you do it fast and clean. You don't need to understand what he's thinking. You don't want to. That's the weirdest part, honestly. Knowing that someone you once trusted is now someone you're afraid of. That feeling doesn't really go away. It just gets pushed aside, like everything else. You adapt and you definitely don't ask about the past. Because in this version of the galaxy, the past doesn't help you survive. It just gets you in trouble. Looking back on it now, it's kind of wild how fast everything happened. 1 minute, you're getting flash trained in a lab on Kamino, still figuring out how to hold a blaster straight, and the next, You're flying across the galaxy, getting dropped into war zones like it's your full-time job. Which, I mean, it was. You were built for it, literally. It wasn't a choice, it was just life. And for a while, you convinced yourself it wasn't that bad. You had your brothers, you had a purpose, you had Jedi generals who, most of the time, actually gave a damn. Some of them even treated you like equals, like actual people. And that made it easier. Having that feeling that, even though you were made in a tube, you still mattered to someone. But that didn't last. Once the war ended, things didn't go back to normal. They just shifted. The Republic turned into the Empire overnight. The Jedi were branded traitors, and you suddenly found yourself enforcing a system that barely remembered your name. You went from being the heroes in armor to just another part of the background. And for the clones who lived long enough to feel that shift, to really sit in it, it stung. You weren't even old yet, and you were already outdated. New soldiers replaced you. Recruits, volunteers, people who didn't know what the war felt like, or what it meant to be created for one purpose and then thrown aside once that purpose was fulfilled. Some clones got reassigned, others were quietly retired, shipped off to places no one talks about. A few managed to disappear, live quiet lives, hide out, try to start over. But it was never really freedom. Not with that kind of past hanging over your head, not with the memories. And that's the thing. The war didn't just leave scars on the body, it wore you down. You could hide it for a while with routine and discipline and jokes in the barracks. But eventually, it caught up. That feeling that maybe you were just temporary. Useful for a moment, then left behind when the moment passed. Still, for all that pain, there was something real there. The brotherhood, the connections, the times you got through hell together and somehow came out laughing. That mattered. That meant something. And if nothing else, the clones knew one thing. No one else could understand what it was like. Not really, unless you were there, growing up under Kamino's endless reign, waking up every day, knowing you were built for a war you didn't start, and walking into battles, knowing that most people wouldn't even remember your name unless you were one of them. You wouldn't get it. But if you were, then you knew. You still know. And honestly, that's enough.